Right. The intros get wackier every year. It's really kind of amazing. Welcome, everybody. My name is Gideon Rose. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs, and we have a great panel for you. Let me just start by saying a word of gratitude to Halifax. There was an era when the world got dark and civilization got threatened, and civilization was being lost, the old ways and learnings were forgotten. And a saving remnant fled to the shores of the North Atlantic to try to preserve some shreds of what was left for future generations. And that's, in many respects, how the Irish saved civilization in places like Skellig Michael and so forth during the Dark Ages. And these days, when dark times are once again spreading across the world, we have, again, been lucky enough to flee to the shores of the North Atlantic, the most extreme remote parts of civilization, to a haven and a refuge from the darkling plain outside where ignorant armies clashed by night. And here in Halifax, the old ways rule. We respect truth, we respect logic, we respect good, clean argument, we respect each other. And this institution embodies public discourse the way it was meant to be. A collective attempt to apply human reason to public affairs and deliberation in order to get some purchase on the challenges facing us and what we can do about them consciously rather than just drift through history. And I just want to thank Peter MacKay and Harjit Singh and Peter van Prague and the patron saint of Halifax, John McCain, now in the Great Conference in the Sky, for what they have created, for the refuge that we can now come to and have these discussions. So I just wanted to thank you, Peter, and thank you, Harjit, and everybody else responsible for Halifax. It shouldn't have to be said, but these days it has to. With regard to the values trade, many of us feel like this is another kind of late 40s time with another superpower with a different set of values as the West confronts what to do with a long-term relationship happening. But unlike the late 40s, unlike the Soviet challenge, the contemporary Chinese challenge posing to the West is not just one of ideology, and not even primarily one of ideology, and it's not just a strategic challenge. It has so many dimensions, including economic dimensions and human rights dimensions, and so many of them conflict. And the question of how to manage the relationship between China and the West with all the different equities involved and protecting them is something we never really had to do with the Soviets. You didn't have the NBA having a substantial equity in the Soviet market, and so it didn't talk about the Gulag because it wanted to preserve its concessions. Now you do. What does it mean to have a relationship with China going forward with all the different dimensions, including some of the stuff we heard about last panel as well, going forward? And that's what we have a great panel to introduce us to and discuss it with today. We have here Dr. Emily Lau, an important voice and politician and activist from Hong Kong, Admiral Karl Schultz, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Lady Pauline Neville-Jones, one of the most distinguished UK diplomats and wise women here to enliven us. Josh Rogin, columnist for the Washington Post and one of the great investigative reporters of our day covering all these issues. So with that, let's get into it. Emily, let's start with you. We heard a lot about Hong Kong last panel, so we don't need to go over the basics. But on the other hand, you actually know what's going on there. So talk a little bit about, in effect, the downside of the Chinese values trade. What is going on and what are the problems that are being posed?
Thank you, Gideon, and I want to thank the Halifax Forum for inviting me here. So when I got the invitation in August, I said, yes, I will come, because I think it's my mission to inform the world of what's going on, and of course, to get international support. So since June up to now, I think I've done countless international interviews, and it's a great pleasure. And at the previous panel meeting, there were so many questions on Hong Kong, and I'm very pleased. And well, what's happening there? We're coming to this almost 6 months of turmoil. We had a big march, 1 million people on the 9th of June, and now we're coming close to the 9th of December, and this thing has not stopped. And as we speak, I think there are still dozens of people trapped in the Polytechnic University in Hong Kong. I am sure many of you have been to Hong Kong. You know the Cross Harbour Tunnel, which has been blocked for many days now. And so it is, maybe if not, it's going to be a humanitarian crisis, Gideon. If you have people trapped inside, the hygiene conditions bad, and they are very cold, and so on. So I just hope that President Xi Jinping, if he's not watching now, I hope his advisors are, although they are of course not invited to this forum, I hope that they will understand that the world is watching. And the Chinese human rights lawyers have told me, because I belong to the Chinese Human Rights Lawyers Concern Group, which was formed in Hong Kong 11 years ago. They say, if someone tells you China does not care about international opinion, don't believe it. Why? The lawyers say, because China cares about faith. Well, in fact, I think many countries do care about faith too. Minister, you can tell us that. But anyway, I think international opinion is important. But of course, we have to do our own thing. And you have seen us performing for more than 5 months. And that's why there were so many questions asked. Of course, things happening in Venezuela, in Egypt, elsewhere, also very gripping. And I think people should care about it, but I'm very grateful. So what we want, and Gideon, what's going to happen on Sunday? There are going to be elections, I hope, district council elections on Sunday. But now, if you go to Hong Kong now, many people will tell you they're very concerned. The government may postpone the election because they say the environment is not conducive. I said there were elections in Afghanistan. No, I don't think you want to compare Hong Kong now with Afghanistan. I don't know how many people have been killed there in recent months. So, my dear friends, Hong Kong is in turmoil. We are facing the biggest crisis in Hong Kong's history, whether it's under British colonial rule or under Chinese rule. So, but we want to get out of it. Many of you have been to Hong Kong. We have no democracy, but we enjoy so many things that a democracy gives, like freedoms, rule of law, independence of the judiciary, and personal safety, which many countries that have periodic elections do not enjoy. Their people do not enjoy. I don't need to go down the list, Gideon. So that's the ironic thing about Hong Kong. And we are not, most of us are not fighting for independence. Don't let the Chinese government misinform you. There may be some, very small number. What we are fighting for is for China to keep the agreement, the promise made in the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984, in the Basic Law of 1997, that Hong Kong can continue to enjoy the capitalist system, our free lifestyle, our rule of law, our personal safety, not forever, for 50 years, until 2047. But Gideon, we are only in 2019, only 22 years. There's still about 27 odd years left. And some people say, Ms. Lau, only 27 years left. I said, have you heard of the expression? In the long term, we're all dead. So why don't you die now? We are not going to die, my friends, and I hope you won't let us die. And it's not, thank you. And it's not just for the love of Hong Kong, which will be good, because I think the speakers in the previous panel said these are universal values. We should care about Venezuela, we should care about Egypt and elsewhere. But there are all more reasons. As I think previous panel or other speakers have said, there are 300,000 Canadian citizens, Minister, living in Hong Kong. Countless Canadian companies operating. And there are many British citizens, and some BNO, of course, and many Americans and so on. It's a very international city. And a few months ago, New Zealand government said they are trying to mount an evacuation campaign. Minister, I hope you don't have to do that. How do you evacuate 300,000 people? So the thing to do is to help Hong Kong to make sure we can continue to enjoy the freedoms and the personal safety. You've been to Hong Kong. It used to be very safe, very peaceful, but no longer. So the situation is bad. I want it to de-escalate, to dial down, not just to have the election on Sunday, but to find a peaceful and civilized resolution, Gideon. And I hope the panel will give us ideas and help us to do it.
Thank you.
Because we have many friends here. I'm so happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. So, Admiral, the world is watching. Is the world, or at least the U.S. forces, going to do anything about it?
I'm not sure I want to follow Emily on that. Gideon, thanks for the question, and thanks, Peter, for the invitation back. I would tell you, as I look through the Indo-Pacific through a maritime lens, I see naval forces, maritime forces, that in large part look a lot like Coast Guards in terms of authorities, in terms of missions. The United States Coast Guard, we're operating in the region to an increasing extent today. Working with allied partners, we're working like-minded nations that share and want to foster a commitment to a secure maritime environment. And we look at China. We look at standardizing, stabilizing interactions with China. But what we're looking for, U.S. naval forces, the United States Coast Guard, allied partners, is the free and open Indo-Pacific first and foremost. We're looking at rule-based order, adherence to international norms. As I look at the China situation, the audio and the video don't match. You look at the islands, dozens of islands now that now have anti-ship, anti-air missiles, the runways. But the rhetoric doesn't match that. We're working with ASEAN partners in the region. I think the sweet spot for United States Coast Guard is building up some of the larger ASEAN partners, doing a lot with the Vietnamese, with the Indonesians, the Malaysians. I was over in the Philippines recently. Philippines have a Navy of 4,000, a Coast Guard of almost 12,000, growing 4,900 a year, growing to 35,000. They're, I think, really looking to bolster their posture. When you wake up as a neighbor of China, that's very different. It's easy to have a view from across the ocean, but their reality is quite different. So we're helping them build their capacity. I was over there with some of our Navy colleagues, Operation Sama-Sama in the Philippines, the Navies, the Coast Guards working together, and they were just so excited to have a national security cutter there. What we see with the naval forces of China, they're approaching 300 ships, and will exceed that here in the coming year. Their Coast Guard is a couple hundred ships. Coast Guard's largest ship 3-4 years ago was 1,500 tons. It's close to 12,000 tons. Our global deployer that we just came heel to toe rotations 10 months consecutive is a 4,600 ton ship. China Coast Guard, as of July 2018, went from being under civilian control to they're under the People's Military Police, which is a direct report to the Chinese Central Party, what they call the People's Armed Force Military or Maritime Militia, operating with direct ties. So there's a gap. I think what is important when you think about the region, a third of the world's maritime commerce, when you sort of expand that to the Asian region, 60% of the maritime commerce, we're trying to do a push in there. I think China wants to obviously grow their maritime forces, displace U.S. influence, and from the United States Coast Guard standpoint, we're part of that team to model the behavior. When a Coast Guard ship shows up any in the world, white hull, orange and blue, iconic race and stripe, that denotes adherence to model maritime governance, just the values of life-saving, of environmental concerns. China replicates that, but they're antagonistic, they're coercive, they're running down, the Philippine or Vietnamese fishermen, and there needs to be a call out. I think a little bit of the face that Emily talked about. It's a little bit of a calling out moment, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Pauline, I was in the UK during Xi's last visit, and a Pakistani friend was just laughing contemptuously, and I said, why? She said, this is England, this is Britain, this is the United Kingdom, and they're behaving like Pakistan. They're just like sucking up to Xi for everything and just to get contracts. How does the values trade with China look from the perspective of the UK?
Well, you can see that there's not unanimity of opinion. I was rather with the Pakistani, I think. Clearly we are at sixes and sevens over our attitude to China. On the one hand, we want the commerce and we want the trade. On the other hand, we're increasingly, I think, anxious about the long term and what this means for freedom and democracy. I think the question that, following what Emily Lara just said was that we have to ask ourselves, despite what President Trump said about being the savior, would China really believe that, were she to use the police, the armed police, or send across the Chinese police into Hong Kong, would there be any price to pay? I think there's some real doubt about whether there'd be much of a price to pay. And that tells you something, it seems to me, about our lack of impact and our disunity. If you look at the policies we're pursuing, I think that we certainly are at the moment much more interested still in the short-term trade. And if anybody hasn't read Steve Tsang's paper, please do so. It is very cogent on this point. And the point he's basically making is the Chinese have a strategy, and I say we don't. And what's that strategy consist of? Well, it is toughening up the situation at home. You can see that happening. Increasing their influence abroad, partly through Belt and Road, not only that, but certainly Belt and Road. They are making strategic acquisitions around the world, but also in democracies, picking up assets cheaply, which in due course might be very interesting for them. They look around the world and they decide where they need to place their investments. I was in Greenland recently. Who else was there? The Chinese. And why were they there? Because of rare earths. They think long term. They are laying the base for acquisitions for the kind of technologies they want to pursue. And at home, I think partly as a result, partly defensively, partly because anyway it's their ambition, but partly defensively, in order to increase their resilience against any kind of pressure from outside, they are moving from the workshop to the laboratory to become a high-tech nation which is unequaled. These are all the ambitions, and they are prepared to pour the money in. They're getting their education where? Partly from the West. In fact, at the moment, largely from the West, probably. So we are feeding something that could be a monster. So what do we do about it? Well, that is I think what we need to think about. And as long as we pursue our relationships with China largely separately on the basis of short-term national interest, I think we are giving away the game. I'm old enough to remember large chunks of the Cold War. It took us a long time. It wasn't a case of being able to do this in 1945. We did it over a period of time, but we did actually come up in the end with a strategy. If you remember, it was the dual strategy of the firmness and pressure and military strength on the one hand, and it was the offer of cooperation and human rights on the other. The dual track, the Admiral doctrine. This isn't the same. And Steve Tsang is quite right to say we can't just do containment because we're far too integrated economically. Were we to pursue that? And these efforts at trade punishment that are going on actually are, on the whole, I think, more damaging than they are actually useful. They send signals, though, and those signals are important. But actually how the Chinese are reacting is to try and safeguard themselves in the longer term. So I don't actually think at the moment that it's serving a great useful purpose. And it is in isolation from what needs to be an overall, much larger, seems to me, fuller strategy. And I'm going to say just a few things about what I think might be in that strategy. And when you go from the analysis to the how, that's when you get into trouble. So here goes. I think we need, obviously, and this is something we've done in the past, and I think this is one of the things, frankly, that's relatively easy, which is actually to decide, and this requires agreement across the democracies, the core of which are the old NATO alliance, but it should go wider than the NATO alliance. And that we need to decide those things, those technologies and those devices which it's important that we don't actually export to China in order to strengthen her military capability gratuitously. We know how to do that. That I don't think is so difficult. What I think is more difficult, actually I think more important, is to also have agreement on where and how we're going to allow the Chinese actually to invest in our economies, given the way they are picking us off with strategic ambition. And that, of course, is partly where the Huawei issue comes in. I might say the British government has its mind on other things and has decided not to decide for the time being. But the decision will have to be taken, and we are disagreed. And it doesn't help, ladies and gentlemen, frankly, for there to be a shouting row across the Atlantic on this subject. What does it do? It gives the Chinese a platform to intervene in the argument, which is exactly what they've done in the UK. So that doesn't help. That's not the way, actually, to solve the disagreement and get agreement on what the basis of policy should be in the future. We have to recognize that the Chinese are very competitive. We've actually got, I think, to organize our economies, that we actually start to be a bit more competitive. And that's a question, obviously, of how we run our societies. And part of the problem of populism is that actually we have allowed inequality to grow inside our societies. And that, in turn, I think affects our productivity. I think the other thing that we need to do, and I think must be part of the strategy, but where the US is in the lead, there are two elements here where I think US leadership's crucial all the way through, but two areas where US leadership really is, fundamental. One is how we as democracies stick together, because not all the democracies who would wish, I think, to be less beholden to the Chinese, less willing to take Chinese products, are equally prosperous. We need actually to think about the extent to which we transfer and willing to transfer technology between us and sustain it between us on a Western basis. Now that requires, I think, probably more willingness on the part of the US to share than I think is the case at the moment, and it's certainly a strategic decision of long range, and one that's very important. The other area where I think, obviously, given what the Admiral's just said, which is the military component, that largely falls as things stand on the US, not exclusively, but largely on the US. I think it's hard to see how other allies are going to contribute an enormous amount, but I do think that in the context of a strategy that was broader in its scope and laid foundations for a new way forward, that one would find that other countries would be more willing, more able, more interested in contributing also to the military side of the relationship with China. So those are some thoughts. China is the challenge of our age. Are we going to meet it? Are we going actually to take it seriously? Or are we somehow going, because we remain divided and because it's too easy actually just to think about the short term, actually, by default, to let China become the dominant power of the 21st century?
Thank you very much, Pauline. So, Josh, this is on your shoulders. Are we going to ignore it? Are we going to deal with it? And if so, how?
Thanks, Gideon. Thanks, everybody, for including me. I think what I can offer here is sort of my honest evaluation of how our government, the U.S. government, the Trump administration, has been handling this challenge. And I think, frankly, they deserve some credit and some criticism. Mm-hmm. First, the credit. The Trump administration has done a lot to reset the conversation by returning to the frame of strategic great power competition, increasing pressure on Beijing on the economic front, clamping down on the worst abuses through law enforcement and economic penalties on China's worst offenders, and talking openly about China's worldwide economic aggression and the Chinese Communist Party influence operations and infiltration of American and international institutions of all kinds.
Yeah.
That's good. Now here's the criticism. The Trump administration has failed to bring along friends and allies due to its corresponding conflicts with those friends and allies. Its aversion to multilateral organizations and the president's poor reputation and behavior abroad. The administration has failed to incorporate American values promotion into its China strategy effectively, in fact, often acquiescing to Beijing's efforts to link issues like human rights and trade to their advantage. And I think you saw that in the Fox and Friends interview this morning. There's a lack of resources needed to back up the new strategy and provide countries with viable alternatives to debt trap economic schemes. I was actually in Vietnam with Defense Secretary Esper yesterday, and he presented the Vietnamese government with another cutter, a second cutter, all right? Thousands of Chinese white hull ships, gray hull, blue hull, whatever. Now they've got two cutters, okay? We're not matching their rising commitment in the region knows it. Inside the administration, there's an interagency struggle wherein the Treasury Department and the National Economic Council often work counter to the objectives of state, DOD, and the NSC. There's an overall lack of clear messaging and a breakdown of diplomatic signaling, part of the chaos of this administration's foreign policy, but that's not China-specific, and the White House can't resist politicizing the China issue somehow, but that's not White House-specific. I thought I could basically give you a great example by actually talking about Huawei, because this is something that a lot of us in this room, including me, have focused on for a very long time. At first blush, when we first started talking about this, it was a tech issue. And then over time, we started to realize, oh, it's a national security issue. Then when the Trump administration came in, oh, now it's a trade issue, right? And then we realized they were busting sanctions, and that was a law enforcement issue. And then, of course, as everyone from Canada knows, that law enforcement action turned it into a diplomatic issue, okay? And, a human rights issue. Would it surprise you to know it's also an academic issue? 50 Huawei research centers in American universities all over the country, right? Would it surprise you to know it's a lobbying issue? The Obama administration's former senior director on the National Security Council for cybersecurity is a registered Huawei lobbyist, Would it surprise you to know that it's a media issue? If you want to hear my story about how Huawei invited me to Shenzhen on a first-class junket to go see the labs to prove that everything was on the up and up, I'd be happy to tell you that at the bar later after the lobsters. It's kind of crazy. When you think back about this evolution, you realize, oh, well, actually it's all one story. And it's not a story about Huawei, it's a story about the Chinese Communist Party's comprehensive, well-funded, well-organized plan to undermine our prosperity, national security, and democratic freedoms. Huawei is just one piece of that, okay? And the piece of that Huawei represents is their pattern, if you put it together with ZTE and WeChat and TikTok, in which the Chinese party state is building out a comprehensive tech strategy to achieve dominance in that domain, and it's working, okay? He who controls the tech platforms can control the conversation. They can control the discussion through amplifying or excising voices and topics and words even on the internet, okay? This is so problematic because underlying the CCP's ambition is their aim to impair free expression, which is central to the party's efforts to compromise our information space to advance their objectives and their incentives at our expense, okay? And, we can talk about all that in the question and answer, but the point here is that, when we talk about the military, economic, it's all one problem. And from the Chinese side, it's all one strategy. And we have to start thinking about it in those terms so that we can develop one response. I'll stop there for now.
Okay. Thank all of you panelists. We're going to bring in our distinguished participants to join the conversation in a second. But first, let me go back to you guys and let me press you on something. I want to play devil's advocate here. This has been a very hawkish panel. And let me see how this kind of thing would work from the other side. Because if I were Chinese, frankly, from somewhere in Beijing associated with the government, I would say you guys are a bunch of hypocritical virtue signalers. Okay, so how does this work? Half a century ago, we were the world's worst tyranny on the planet. You were happy to ally with us and work with us then, when we were in the midst of the Cultural Revolution and its sequelae. You wanted us to grow, and we grow. You wanted us to power the world economy, and we did. You wanted us to bring prosperity to our people, and we have raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the greatest humanitarian move in all of world history. You wanted us to actually learn this stuff and not just be a little set of maquiladoras, but actually generate some technology and independent stuff so we could be an engine for world growth as well. And we did. And now we're rich and our companies are good and they're actually starting to compete with you guys. And while we're not as bad as we used to be, we're not that great. And you guys who are all in the midst of your own hypocritical, ridiculous political crises, full of corruption, full with liberal democracy being the poster child for dysfunctional government in the world, you guys then happily settle on a new yellow peril enemy in China to basically get some domestic consensus against all the things that basically are failures of your own society's inability to compete. because we're actually being a part of world governance by joining things like the Paris Climate Accords. When you're walking away, we're taking part in a whole bunch of international institutions like you guys no longer do. So why don't you guys stop talking about all the bad things we do and all the things you're going to do to us, which you never actually do, and just deal with things the way we used to do. What is different about China now, except for the fact that it's gotten strong enough to bother us?
I would just say, let's look at sustainment, food sustainment. There's a recent report by NGO and a consultant group of 152 coastal nations. China ranked last in terms of illegal and regular unreported fishing. I mean, you go down and you talk to the Argentinians who are having conflict with Chinese fishing boats. Same challenge over in Ecuador. You go around the African continent. The largest exporter of seafood is the Chinese. The third largest importer is the Chinese. You say it's the second largest economy, but their flag state performance or port performance is woefully lacking. So I think it's the rhetoric and the activities. There's just a huge delta there. And I would tell you there's a global sustainment food challenge there a little bit. And I think we're trying to work as the United States Coast Guard on the international stage to say, how do you put a narrative around this IUU fishing writ large? But when you have hundreds of fishing boats in your distant water tuna fleet and you're not operating your AIS, which is your signal or your VMS vessel monitoring system, there's a failure to comply and there's a willful neglect there. So I'd say that's one example, Gideon.
Okay.
I'm going to try to rebut as many of your Chinese Communist Party talking as I can before the lobsters come out. But I think you present to them. I think they're important to understand. Okay, so first of all, the history, right? I think a shorthand could be, and I realize this is complicated, but to boil it down, that the implicit deal we had when we supported economically, politically, and also financially the rise of the Chinese Communist Party-led state, the implicit deal was that would lead them to greater liberalization and encourage them, incentivize them to participate in our system based on the rules-based order that we set up that is supposed to protect all of our freedom, sovereignty, prosperity, and independence, okay? And it was the Chinese Communist Party that decided to, rather than do that, especially since Xi Jinping came to power, but to actually work against that and to use our system against us and actually undermine that system and replace it with a system that's more favorable to their interests. In other words,
this royal we, by the way.
Well, we're in a community of experts and officials here who believe in certain things and certain values, right? And if we believe in those values, then we believe in the system that's based around those values, then they're worth protecting and worth defending. And we have to be honest about the fact that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't share those values and that their engagement with us is actually intended to undermine that system. It's a systems battle, okay? Now, that doesn't, we could have a historical debate over whether or not it was smart at that time to give them the option, right? There are plenty of China hands who will say, oh, it was the responsible thing to do to give them that option to join our system in good faith, and they just made a bad decision. There are some people who say, oh, no, we never should have let them into PNTR and funneled trillions of dollars into their economy so that they could build the machine that they're using to compete against us. For me, that's irrelevant, okay? We are where we are, and we just have to realize that if we want to preserve our system, we have to defend it. That takes me to competition. Oh, the Chinese say, oh, you just don't want to.
This is your last point, because then Emily's going to go in.
Okay, 2 more points.
Points.
Why can't we just compete? Well, because they're not competing fair. Because Huawei, for example, is based on decades of gross intellectual property theft, subsidies, intelligence, exploitation and manipulation, okay? Where's the smoking gun? It's in Addis Ababa at the AU headquarters. What's the risk? Oh, there's backdoors everywhere. The British intelligence has backed this up, although you may not be choosing to follow their advice. So the competition has to be fair, which means, again, defend the principles of reciprocity and transparency and accountability. Last point.
Great.
We raised a trillion people out from poverty. Well, that's great, but it would be great if the Chinese Communist Party didn't use that to try to reframe our concept of human rights and dignity to justify the internment and torture of 3 million and probably a lot more innocent people, okay? So you can't use economic agency as an excuse for mass atrocities, okay? And if we don't stand for that, we don't stand for anything. I'll stop there.
Emily, do you want to chip in on this, or do you want to go into the question?
No, I think you did a great job presenting the Chinese government's views. Maybe you get a first-class ticket to Beijing and they get you as their consultant. And I think, is it Joshua? I think he's right in saying that the Chinese know the weakness not just of the West, of democracies, but of humankind. What? Greed, money. And they hire a lot of your former officials and politicians to be their consultants, to be their lobbyists. So they know your game very well. And they know your companies, your governments are crazy for money. Not everybody, but many. And I wouldn't say you would kill for money, but you would do many things. And the Chinese know it. So that is the problem. Well, I have nothing against China joining the WTO in 2001. But then, when they didn't follow the rules, very few people spoke up. So what I think, I'm not in favor of penalizing China, sanctioning China. Well, they should be a member of the international community. But they should abide by the conduct of behavior, not, of course, of the hypocrites. But you should expect them. And you should expect reciprocity. They come to Canada, Minister. This is an open society. Their students, their academics, their journalists, they can operate freely. But your people go there. Can they operate freely? Of course not. So why do you tolerate it? You should demand it. You say, well, I give this to you. Why don't you give that treatment to my citizens? Why don't you do it? Now, you have a chance to speak. You speak for your country, your government. Why don't you demand reciprocity? Is it because if you do it, you will make less money? You will make enemies. So your government, your company will not get as rich. Is that the problem? So the problem is with us, Gideon.
Emily, I think you're 100% right. That is actually a perfect segue. Who would like to speak? Yes, over here. Please stand, state your name. Wait for the mic, stand, state your name, and ask a short, brief question.
Good afternoon. Fee Shepherd from the UK. I'm one of the Peace with Women Fellows. It's tremendous to be here. My question is really short, a bit like me. I'm a huge optimist, naturally, but I do worry that it's already too late for some nations in this debate. What are your views on that, and how can you make me feel optimistic and ready for lobster?
Anybody want to? Okay. By the way, the most interesting second domino after Hong Kong would be Taiwan. But anybody want to talk about the trend, the continuation of where trends go and what that actually means?
I think it's never too late. No. I mean, if you take the view it's too late, then you've given up already before you've begun. It's never too late. Leaving it later and later and later makes it more difficult. There's any question about that. I mean, I am less hawkish, actually, than my neighbour, though I may have sounded like a hawk. Because I do actually think there has to be a component of our policy which is actually an offer of cooperation. If you look at the way we handle the Soviet Union, that was exactly what we did. There were two bits to the thing. And they could, in a sense, choose. And I think we have to put forward a proposition which also doesn't actually take them at their word, but which does deal with the issue of unfair competition that you pointed out perfectly fairly, but actually says also, we're prepared to cooperate with you on these following things, and there's no reason why we shouldn't cooperate on some science and technology issues. I mean, without doing that, there's less prosperity around the world. So there is a cooperation agenda, but we need to decide collectively where we're going to put it. And our problem, my issue is, it's us, not them, it's us. Our policies are the problem at the moment. And that's why we need to get our act together. And I think it's difficult, but possible.
Can I just very quickly?
Two finger.
I just traveled to 4 different Southeast Asian nations. I got 4 different reactions, okay? Thailand is hedging. South Korea is seeking more American engagement. Vietnam, they don't like the Chinese Communist Party, okay? They're much more willing to be aggressive, okay? The Philippines, whole different story, okay? So there's no cookie cutter approach, all right? That's why some sort of statement of strategy and values and principles would be helpful in coalescing, But in the end, I think it's not too late because, first of all, we have to still give the Chinese government the chance to change its behavior, okay? Yeah. And we have to engage them in that effort. And I don't think I'm hawkish. I think I'm very clear-eyed.
Right.
And we have to make sure that we've tried every possible opportunity to bring them into the fold and to encourage them to do the right thing. meanwhile building resilience in plans and defense and offense in the case that they don't decide to do the right thing.
I
hope
don't
the
think
dog
it's
knows
too
what to do
late.
with the car when it catches it.
I don't think we should despair. And the fact that we are having this forum here, Peter, and if there is a consensus that there is a problem, if the Halifax Forum can come up with some proposals, and there are people from so many different countries, so many democracies, if they can begin to adopt a strategy, I think we can take it forward. Never, never despair, my dear. I come from Hong Kong. So don't despair. Never too late.
Thank you. We're going to do paired questions now, just to get them over in. Here and here. So wait, please, Mike over here, Mike over here. We'll get two ones in. State your name, and identify yourself. Please stand up so we can see.
I'm Lobsang, President of the Tibetan administration. My question is to bring China to respect the values and principles of the international community. How can we inculcate those values in China? For example, 5.2 million Chinese students studied in Western universities, of which 3.1 million returned to China, and they are at the leadership level. Still, the China that we see is contrary to the international values and norms. Now, how can we, if the leadership is not doing it, how can we bring those values inside China if we have not done it with 3.1 million students who have returned?
Thank you very much. And over here, we'll bundle two.
Hi, I'm Watanabe from Tokyo. I have a question about decoupling of Chinese economy. So recently, U.S. Vice President Pence's speech is no decoupling. Of course, the decoupling is very difficult to implement, but also without doing anything is nothing to the influence of the Chinese government behavior. Probably the answer would be between, do something, but not completely decoupling. Maybe smarter way. I'm sure that some panel may have a good idea. So that's my question.
So actually, those are two really good questions, because one of the scariest things for me, you talked about the students and the demands for reciprocity, and you talked about the tech and how we know we can cut off this kind of thing and should cut off that. The intersection of those things in many respects is the educational systems and the scientific collaboration and the patents and the economic collaboration. And if you start actually decoupling the tech sectors and the educational sectors, you have spill-on effects with lots of different things, including supply. The question of what decoupling actually means, if it will come about, is a huge, huge issue which people are bandying about. And the question to you guys is the road we're starting down on already in terms of the dividing of the systems from whatever we might have thought about the systems converging, we're now clearly not converging and going the other direction. Where does that lead a few years down the road? What does decoupling look like in practice? And will it, if 3.1 million didn't do it, how will cutting off the supply of Chinese students help liberalize it down the road?
I'm not in favor of cutting off supplies of this decoupling. They are a member of the international community, so we should encourage them to adopt a civilized conduct of behavior. About the students, I know even in Canada, in some of your university campuses, there have been very rowdy scenes of students confronting people who say something bad about China and so on. Why should that sort of behavior be allowed? In my alma mater, the London School of Economics, recently they decided to stop donations from some Chinese source, millions of pounds of donations, because they want to set up some faculty teaching Chinese economics and all that. But under the supervision of a board appointed by them. So when my professor, Chris Hughes, learned about it, no way. He said, this is an insult to our university. That was at the very last stage, because the university just thought, oh, money, money, we love it. Come, come, we give you all, surrender our sovereignty to you. I'm sorry, LSE. but the professor stopped it. So that is the thing, my dear friend. We should not allow it to happen, whether it's in Canadian or British or American or any country's campuses, because that's not the behavior that we allow and we expect. So if they learn it, when they go back, they will practice it. But what do? We tolerate it. We want more students, more money, more donations, and we are willing to turn a blind eye to such disgraceful behavior. So, I mean, of course, they are to blame. But what about ourselves?
We're getting a full share of it here. Pauline, hold on a second. Pauline wanted to jump in, yes.
No, I just wanted to say that I don't think this is an all or nothing issue. We should go on having students. That's pretty clear to me. What we need to have decided is one, we're not going to have Confucius centers, financed by the Chinese government, who are going to decide, the way in which certain things are taught. That's out. So this is a row going on Australia at the moment. Secondly, we need to be very clear about those things that we're not going to let Chinese students get into, and those will be some of the really important technologies. So you've got to have a much more detailed. This isn't blunt policy. This is detailed, fine detailed policy, where you're very clear about what's on limits and what's off limits, and probably over time it'll change. But that's what I'm trying to plead for. Is that we need to go into this thing in really great detail about what we have to safeguard and what we can let go.
Okay. No, you already had your questions.
I have a decoupling point.
You can put it in your okay, one quick decoupling.
Okay. The decoupling is happening not because the American-China hawks have decided it's happening. It's happening because the risks and costs of doing business in China are going up due to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government's behavior. If you look at the NBA, the reason that they're in the soup they're in is because they didn't realize the risks of doing business in China. They didn't calculate it. By the time they were in the trouble, it was too late. Okay, and the Chinese government punished them economically for free speech, and now they're in a lot of trouble, so they have to decouple. If you look at Wall Street shoveling trillions of dollars of US investors' money into Chinese companies, and then Washington sanctions those companies, and then the capital markets fund those companies, it's untenable. It doesn't make any sense, okay? And as the Chinese companies are controlled by the state and do worse behavior, that puts us at risk and forces us to defend ourselves. That's why we're decoupling, okay? It's risky, it's bad, but it's not our choice. It's what we must do to defend ourselves.
Okay, we're going to have the last.
The question will be whether the Chinese actually learn a lesson from that.
I don't think so. They haven't.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
It'll be very interesting to see. I'm going to do two last questions to bundle, and then we're going to go in for the final comments.
There's
Yes.
a lady.
Oh, sorry.
I think we should give a question
Yes,
to a
I
lady.
haven't seen. Yes, right. Yes, back there.
What was my
Wait, no, that's
officer
not.
if she isn't a lady?
Yeah.
Okay.
Decoupling or not, Joseph Jaffe. Decoupling. I want to pose a question to you, Josh. You seem to know the scene, and you made a very, very good point. He who controls the platform controls the conversation. Now, can you tell me, where is Cisco? Where is Deutsche Telekom? Where is Vodafone? Where is France Telecom? We can't build 5G or 6G. So this is not a decoupling issue. Why are we staring at Huawei like a rabbit at a snake? What's wrong with our wonderful, wonderful high-tech companies?
Okay, hold on a second. Before you answer that, we have one last question over here. Sorry, yes, I promised this guy one. Up, quick.
Michael Bossack, I'm from beautiful British Columbia. We have the honor of hosting Meng Wanzhou, who's under house arrest in our province. Anyway, my question is kind of related. In regards to Huawei and 5G, it seems a lot of the countries who are members of the Five Eyes are splintered or splitting in opinion on whether to allow 5G in. And I think even the UK has questions about this. Maybe for Lady Neville-Jones, do you think that this debate over allowing Huawei to participate in 5G in the Five Eyes countries is creating perhaps a dangerous potential threat or splinter?
Okay, and we'll do this, and we'll wrap this up with your final comments such as they are. So we'll go answer to either the question if you want, and any final comments you might. First of all, does anybody have any questions? Did anybody want to answer the questions and begin their final thing? So Josh, this is your answer to the questions and final
my
statement.
wrap, okay.
In a minute.
In a minute, got it. Okay, I'll talk really fast. There is no good alternative for Huawei, and it's not Huawei. It's the basket of incentives of diplomatic, economic, political, and corrupt packages that the Chinese government gives you when they sell you the Huawei infrastructure at 70% off market price. Okay, we haven't figured out how to counter that. It's true that there are no American companies that produce it, but there are European companies and South Korean companies. There's a way out of this to create a package that these countries might take if we would come together and figure it out for them, but we've failed to do that. We've failed to give countries a viable alternative. And that leads me to the broader point, which you raised, which is that, you know, we go around to these countries and we're at the stage of admiring the problem, okay? And oh yeah, you shouldn't do Huawei. There's gonna be penalties for you. We have a finger to wag at you if you stock your country with Huawei stuff. Not to mention, rural US is lousy with Huawei equipment, but that's a separate issue. You know, it's all negative incentives. Where's the positive engagement? Okay, where's the part of it that says no? We're not forcing you to choose between the U.S. and China. We don't want to put any countries to that choice. What we want to do is we want to give you a fair choice where you can choose a system based on our values: openness, transparency, data privacy, accountability, good governance, rule of law. That's actually better. Okay, in a race to the top, we win. Okay, but if it's a race to the bottom, we'll surely lose.
I'm glad to know those are our values. I was unsure for a bit. Pauline.
The gentleman asked a question about how we deal with the human rights agenda. There aren't many perfect answers, but one of them is that we have to live it ourselves, which I don't think we're doing really very effectively at the moment. And we certainly don't have a set of ideas about what we should try to present to the Chinese as the kind of values we want to defend. On Huawei, there is a disagreement, and it's composed really of the intellectual and political disagreement is whether it is possible safely to have Huawei anywhere in your system. And the UK maintains, and this is the intelligence services themselves, that it is perfectly possible to segregate those areas where you certainly don't let Huawei in, but it doesn't follow that you cannot let Huawei into any part of your 5G system. That is a sort of none of it. The other factor, of course, is that Huawei is already in our system. If we had to, under pressure, in order to maintain intelligence cooperation, and I don't know whether intelligence cooperation would actually stand this kind of pressure, but in order to maintain it, we had to strip out all the Huawei elements that we have already in the system, and we're not permitted to use Huawei anywhere else. We have a setback of about 10 years and an extreme increase in cost. So it's a very big issue. And we won't be the only Europeans in that position. And our problem is that, there's Nokia and Ericsson, neither of them are anything like as advanced, unfortunately, and certainly not as cheap. And so there's a cost element in all of that. And that is my point when I said that the US needs to decide. Does it actually want to beat its allies over the head, or does it want to share? Because actually it's a choice if you want to keep the alliance together. The US does have to do it, and leading by knocking people on the head for bad behavior won't get us anywhere, I have to say. Sorry about the passion, but these negative signals are really bad for alliance cooperation, and that's come back to what I was saying. It is about us deciding what we're going to do together, and we have to talk to each other and go into great detail.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Admiral Schultz, do you favor beating up allies on the head?
Yeah, I would. Depends on the day. I would tell you, on Josh's point, the state-owned enterprise thing is rampant, and I think until you figure out a way to deal with it, and one mechanism, I think, is multilateral voices. The fishing industry is backed by the state-owned enterprise. How do you compete there? You look at the non-Arctic state. Secretary Pompeo called them out at the ministerial here, Arctic recent ministerial, and, people have to recognize that China will have more Arctic shipbuilding capacity than the United States here. They launched a second ship last year. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, now the Polar Silk Road Initiative. You got to call it out for what it is. We've seen the Sri Lankan example, Djibouti.
We should stop it, or we should try and compete?
I think we have to be cognizant and call it out for what it is. I think that's part of it, and then I think you have to multilaterally get after it and say, where are we going to find common ground and compete, maybe on a more global level. But
they should be permitted to. you can't stop them, building ships to go through the Northeast.
But when you look at the ports, Lady Neville-Jones, a port, they're dual-purpose ports. There's an economic piece and it's a military piece. Mm-hmm. And we should have a conversation about what that is. I think the Sri Lankans might not have signed a 99-year deal if they had some other folks come to help. And they look at Papua New Guinea. You look at 70 ports around the world. You look at the Bahamas where Dorian just hit, and they were talking about a deep water port on the north side of Abaco Island. There's no strategic use for that port now. Yeah.
Emily, do you want to have any brief final comment?
I think, again, it's about money. Huawei It's much cheaper. That's why many countries
Exactly.
want to have it. And you talk about Nokia, Ericsson, and I'm sure that from your countries you're here, it's much more expensive. So what do you do to your people? They cannot have access to good communication unless they pay a lot. And maybe America can help. I'm sure there are Americans here, isn't it? They can take the message back to your country. If you refuse to cooperate, to help, then there are many countries that I want to use Nokia, but I don't have the money. What do I do? What? Huawei! So I think the problem is not as complicated, Gideon. So again, Peter, we flush out the problems here. It's for you, for the Halifax Forum, to find the solutions and to convince your allies and friends to see if we can do something about it. Otherwise, next year, when you come back, the problem would be a lot worse. It's not going to go away, isn't it? So
And
I think
that's why we'll always have Halifax. On that note, let me just say that what Churchill said about the West's relationship with Xi Jinping is also true about Halifax 2019. This is not the end. It is not the beginning of the end. But ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the beginning. And we look forward not just to discussing the future of the U.S. and Western relationship with China and all its various equities over dinner and the rest of the weekend and in future years, but we invite all of you to have a wonderful Halifax future. This panel is officially over. Thank all of our guests and thank all of you.